Rachel had always believed in the power of perseverance. Growing up in a modest home where her parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet, she understood early on that success rarely came without sacrifice. It was this belief that shaped her resolve and guided her through the challenges of marriage to Kunle. He was ambitious, determined, and full of dreams, qualities that had drawn her to him from the start. But dreams without means often carried weight, and Rachel found herself shouldering much of that burden in the early years of their marriage. Kunle's career had been tough right from the start. His ideas were always full of promise, but things seemed to go wrong every time. Some months, he would come home with nothing to show for his efforts, looking tired and defeated. But Rachel never let him stay in that dark place. She was always there to lift him up, reminding him of his value, even when everything seemed to be working against him. The nights were the hardest. As they lay on their old mattress in their tiny apartment, Kunle would share his worries in a quiet, strained voice. "Rachel, I just need one chance. Just one opportunity to prove myself." His words carried both hope and frustration, filling the small room and weighing on Rachel's heart. She would take his hand, holding it tightly to show she was with him through it all. "You'll make it," she would say, her voice calm, even though doubt crept into her mind. "I believe in you." Rachel's own sacrifices during these times were countless but rarely acknowledged. She had taken on multiple jobs, teaching during the day and sewing late into the night, to keep their household afloat. There were days she skipped meals so Kunle could have enough to eat, insisting she wasn't hungry, even as her stomach churned with emptiness. She stretched every naira, negotiating with vendors at the market until they relented, and patched up her old clothes to save money for Kunle's business proposals. Despite their financial struggles, Rachel often found moments that reminded her why she had chosen Kunle. She would think back to the evenings they spent on their small balcony, sipping tea from mismatched cups. The city lights flickered in the distance, a gentle reminder of the bigger world they longed to be part of. Kunle would speak with so much passion about his plans, his hands waving energetically as he described every little detail. Rachel would sit quietly, listening intently, her heart swelling with pride at his vision. Yet deep down, a small part of her couldn't help but wonder if those dreams would ever become a reality. But ambition, she had come to learn, could be both a gift and a curse. As Kunle's determination grew, so did the distance between them. There were times when his frustrations boiled over into sharp words and cold silences. "Do you even understand what it's like to have so much potential and no way to prove it?" he snapped one evening after a particularly tough day. Rachel flinched but said nothing, choosing instead to let him vent. She understood his anger wasn't directed at her. It was the weight of his unfulfilled dreams crushing him. The pressure was wearing Rachel down. There were times when she wondered if she had done enough. Had her constant encouragement truly helped Kunle, or had she just been pushing him toward dreams that would never come true? The doubt gnawed at her, but she forced herself to bury it deep inside. What mattered most was holding their family together, no matter how tough things got. Everything changed one afternoon when Kunle got a call about a possible contract. His excitement was impossible to ignore as he shared the news with Rachel. "This could be it, Rachel. This could be the break we've been waiting for." For the first time in months, she felt hope. Real, solid hope, like something she could reach out and hold. Still, even as Rachel held on to hope, she began to notice changes in Kunle. He was more driven than ever, throwing himself completely into his work. But with his focus came a growing distance between them. He seemed distracted, his attention constantly pulled away by the buzz of his phone and the steady tapping of his laptop keys. Their late-night talks, once filled with shared dreams and quiet promises, slowly disappeared, replaced by long stretches of silence. Rachel tried to reassure herself that it was temporary, that this was just the cost of building the future they had both worked so hard to achieve. Looking back, Rachel would later wonder if those small changes were the first signs of trouble in their marriage. At the time, they didn't seem like a big deal, just part of what happens when someone is working hard to achieve success. But later, she realized they were warnings, quietly hinting at the challenges ahead. For now, though, Rachel chose to believe that everything they had been through would eventually be worth it. She had put so much of herself into Kunle, into his dreams, his struggles, and his potential. She couldn't picture a future where all their sacrifices didn't lead to something better, where the life they had imagined didn't come true. So, she kept moving forward, not knowing that the success they had prayed for would soon test their marriage like never before. The day Kunle signed the 80 million naira contract, Rachel's heart swelled with pride. She had always believed in his ability to achieve greatness, and now it was finally happening. For years, she had prayed for this moment, supported him when no one else did, and stayed by his side through every setback. His success felt like her success, a reward for all the hard times they had endured together. But as Kunle's pen left the paper, neither of them realized how much this moment would change their lives, or their relationship. At first, Kunle's excitement was impossible to resist. That night, he couldn't sit still, pacing the living room with his phone glued to his ear. He spoke with so much energy, tossing out plans, ideas, and figures so quickly that Rachel could barely keep up. She sat quietly, watching him with a mix of pride and nervousness. She wanted to believe that this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, the one that would bring them closer together. But it wasn't long before the cracks began to show. Kunle announced that he needed to move to Abuja to oversee the project. The decision was sudden, and while Rachel hesitated, she eventually agreed. "It's just for now," he reassured her, holding her hand in his. "Once I secure more contracts, we'll finally have the life we've always dreamed of." Rachel nodded, though unease settled in her chest. She told herself it was temporary, just another hurdle they had to overcome. But as the weeks turned into months, Kunle's presence in their home became increasingly rare. At first, Rachel tried to push aside the loneliness that crept in during the quiet nights. She threw herself into caring for their children, managing her job, and keeping the household running. She told herself that Kunle's absence was part of the sacrifice they had to make for a better future. In the beginning, he would call often, his voice filled with warmth as he shared stories about his day. Those calls gave her comfort, a reminder that he was still connected to her, even from afar. But as the weeks went by, the calls became shorter, more routine, lacking the reassurance she had once clung to. Then came the rumors. It started innocently enough, casual mentions from neighbors and acquaintances. "Oh, I saw Kunle in Lagos the other day," one said, her tone laced with curiosity. Another chimed in. "He looked like he was in a hurry. Abuja must really be keeping him busy." Rachel's smile froze each time, her mind racing to make sense of it. Why hadn't he told her he was in Lagos? The city was their home, the place they had built their lives together. Was it a simple oversight, or something more? Rachel's suspicions grew stronger the day she discovered a receipt in one of Kunle's suit pockets. It was from an expensive restaurant in Lagos, dated just 2 days earlier, a time when he had told her he was in Abuja. She stared at the slip of paper, her heart pounding, and her stomach twisting with unease. She tried to convince herself it might mean nothing, but the seed of doubt had already taken root, refusing to be ignored. Confronting him was harder than she imagined. When he returned home for a brief visit, she brought up the receipt, her voice trembling. "Kunle, why didn't you tell me you were in Lagos?" His reaction was immediate. A flash of irritation crossed his face before he forced a smile. "Rachel, you're overthinking. I was there for a quick meeting. It wasn't worth mentioning." The explanation felt hollow, but she let it slide, unwilling to push further. She told herself she was being paranoid, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But deep down, the seeds of doubt had already taken root. Over the next few months, Kunle's transformation became impossible to ignore. He started wearing designer clothes, accessorizing with expensive watches and shoes that gleamed like polished mirrors. His phone buzzed constantly, and he began taking calls in hushed tones, often walking out of the room to speak privately. Rachel tried to rationalize it, telling herself that this was simply the reality of his new role. But the growing distance between them was undeniable. Their conversations became surface level, devoid of the warmth and intimacy they once shared. When she tried to discuss her feelings, he dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "Rachel, you worry too much. Everything I'm doing is for us, for this family." But was it really for them? The final straw came during Christmas, a time that had always been sacred to their family. Kunle promised to spend the holiday at home, but as the days passed, it became clear he had no intention of coming. Instead, Rachel received a flurry of messages from friends and relatives, all recounting how they had spotted him in Lagos with another woman. "She's beautiful," one text read, followed by a photo. Rachel's hands trembled as she stared at the image. A glamorous woman, older than Kunle, dressed in an outfit that exuded wealth. The caption beneath the photo reads, "Kunle and his new woman." The betrayal struck Rachel like a punch to the chest, leaving her reeling. The room seemed to blur around her, and her breath came in short, uneven gasps. She could hear her children calling her name, but their voices felt far away, as if coming from the other end of a tunnel. Every part of her wanted to scream, to confront Kunle, to demand an explanation, but instead, she sank into silence, overwhelmed by the weight of her heartbreak. She clung to the memories of the man she had once known, the man who had shared her dreams, her struggles, her life. Where had that man gone? And how had they come to this? That night, as Rachel sat alone in the unsettling silence of their home, a harsh truth settled over her. The wealth they had prayed for had come at a price she never could have foreseen. The dreams they had shared, the sacrifices they had made, now felt like they had been traded for something hollow, something that was slowly breaking her. Rachel had always known that marriage wasn't perfect, but nothing had prepared her for the moment her world began to unravel. It happened on an ordinary evening, quiet and still, when Kunle came home after weeks of absence. There was no joy in his return, no gentle kiss on her cheek, no reassuring smile that once felt like home. Instead, he walked in with a distant coldness, his eyes avoiding hers as he strode past her and into the living room, leaving a void in his wake. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Rachel's chest felt tight as she stood frozen in the doorway, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had been waiting for this moment, going over in her mind what she would say when he finally came back. But now, as she stood face to face with him, all the words she had carefully prepared slipped away, leaving her with nothing but silence. "Kunle," she began, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound calm. "I need to talk to you." He sighed, dropping his keys onto the coffee table with a deliberate clink. "Not now, Rachel. I'm tired." But she couldn't let it go. The doubt, the rumors, the sleepless nights, all of it had built into a storm that demanded to be unleashed. She stepped closer, her voice rising despite herself. "Tired? Kunle, you've been gone for weeks without telling me where you were. People have seen you in Lagos, And you didn't even bother to call. What is going on? Kunle's expression darkened. He stood, towering over her, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Are you checking up on me now? Is that what this is? Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. I'm not checking up on you, Kunle. I'm your wife. I deserve to know where you've been and why you're lying to me. And then it happened. The words she never thought she would hear. Maybe I don't want to do this anymore, Rachel. Maybe I'm done. The room spun. For a moment, Rachel thought she had misheard him, that her ears were playing a cruel trick. But the coldness in his voice, the finality in his tone, left no room for doubt. What are you saying? She whispered, her voice cracking. Kunle's eyes bore into hers, unflinching. I want a divorce. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Rachel felt as though the floor beneath her had given way, leaving her suspended in a void of disbelief. She stumbled backward, her breath hitching as she tried to process his words. Kunle, you don't mean that, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. We've been through so much together. You can't just walk away. But his expression remained stone-like, unmoved by her plea. I've made up my mind, Rachel. This isn't working. The argument escalated, their voices rising like thunderclaps in the small living room. Rachel accused him of betrayal, of abandoning their family when they needed him most. Kunle shot back with accusations of his own, blaming her for being too controlling, too demanding. Each word was a dagger, slicing through the fragile remnants of their bond. At some point, Rachel's anger gave way to grief. She sank onto the couch, her head in her hands, as sobs racked her body. You can't do this, she choked out. You can't leave me. I've given you everything. Kunle didn't respond. He simply walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. The next day, he packed his things and left without a word. In the days that followed, Rachel tried to make sense of it all. Her parents called to console her, but their words stung more than they soothed. Kunle sent us 2 million naira each, her mother said, her tone unusually soft. You should try to work things out with him, Rachel. A man like Kunle doesn't come around every day. Rachel stared at the phone in disbelief. Even her own mother seemed to side with him, blinded by his newfound wealth. It was as though everyone had forgotten the years she had spent building him up, supporting him when no one else would. The loneliness was overwhelming. The house, which had once been alive with laughter and warmth, now felt cold and empty, like a shadow of the life they once shared. Rachel found herself wandering aimlessly from room to room, each step stirring memories that refused to let her rest. She replayed every argument, every moment of tenderness, every promise they had whispered to each other in the dark. Questions haunted her. Had she pushed him too hard? Had she failed as a wife? The weight of her guilt pressed down on her chest, suffocating and relentless. But as the days turned into weeks, Rachel began to see the truth for what it was. Kunle had changed, and no amount of pleading or self-blame would bring him back. The man she had loved, the one she had built her life around, was gone. And in his place was a stranger who had chosen wealth and ambition over their family. Still, a small part of her clung to hope. She prayed every night, her words a desperate plea for strength and clarity. God, please, she whispered, her voice breaking, bring him back to me. And so, she waited. Rachel had heard the rumors long before she saw the proof. People had been talking, hints of Kunle's new life reaching her from every corner, like sharp little pieces of glass carried by the wind. At first, she ignored them, refusing to believe that the man she had built her life with could so easily slip away. But denial is fragile, and hers broke the moment the photograph fell into her hands. Late one evening, her phone buzzed with a message from an old acquaintance. "Rachel, I thought you should see this," it said, followed by an image that hit her like a punch to the stomach. There was Kunle, standing beside a woman who seemed to be everything Rachel now feared she wasn't. The woman was striking, her high cheekbones and confident air shining even through the screen. She looked older, her elegance clear in the way her designer dress draped around her and the subtle sparkle of her jewelry. Kunle stood next to her, looking completely at ease, his smile relaxed and genuine. It wasn't the forced, tired smile Rachel had grown used to seeing. It was warm, happy, and it had been far too long since she had seen it aimed at her. Rachel's chest tightened as she stared at the photo, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing against her as a dull roar filled her ears. She wanted to scream, to throw the phone as far as she could, but instead, she sat there, paralyzed. Her eyes drifted to the caption beneath the image, "Kunle and his woman." The days that followed blurred together in a fog of pain and confusion. Friends and family, sensing her distress, overwhelmed her with advice she hadn't asked for. "Rachel, you need to fight for your marriage," one friend said, as if she wasn't already fighting an invisible war within herself. "Men will always be men," another chimed in, the words hitting her like a slap. Even her mother, the woman who had once scolded her for crying over small things, seemed to side with Kunle. "Rachel, don't push him away," she said gently one afternoon, her tone softer than usual. "He's a good man. He's just lost his way." A good man. The phrase echoed in Rachel's mind, sharp and bitter. Was he a good man when he left her to raise their children on her own? When he proudly showed off another woman in Lagos, while she sat at home, holding on to the broken pieces of their life together? The questions spun in her head, each one weighing heavier than the last, suffocating her with their unspoken answers. Kunle's transformation was impossible to ignore. The man who once wore mismatched pajamas and laughed with their children now walked confidently in tailored suits, his polished shoes clicking against marble floors Rachel would never step on. He even wore a small stud earring in his left ear, a glittering symbol of how much he had changed. It felt like the final piece of the man she once knew had slipped away, replaced by someone she barely recognized. The woman by his side seemed to belong in his new world, one Rachel could no longer reach. The children felt his absence more deeply than Rachel had expected. Her youngest, just 5 years old, asked about him almost every day, her innocent eyes filled with confusion. "When is Daddy coming home?" she would ask, clutching an old toy he had given her as if it might bring him back. Rachel forced herself to smile through the ache in her chest, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Soon," she would reply softly, her voice unsteady. "Daddy's just very busy with work." Her eldest, however, was not so easily reassured. At 9 years old, she had begun to pick up on the cracks in their family, even if she didn't fully understand them. One evening, as Rachel tucked her into bed, her daughter looked up with wide, serious eyes and asked the question Rachel had been dreading. "Mommy, does Daddy still love us?" The words pierced Rachel's heart like a knife. She blinked rapidly, willing the tears to stay hidden. "Of course he does," she whispered, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. "Daddy loves you very much. He's just busy right now." But the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. How could she explain to her children the betrayal she barely understood herself? In the stillness of the night, when the house was quiet and her thoughts refused to rest, Rachel wrestled with a storm of emotions. She hated Kunle for what he had done, for the pain he had inflicted on her and their children. But what hurt even more was the shameful truth that she still wanted him back. She replayed every argument, every uneasy moment, trying to pinpoint where it had all gone wrong. Had she been too controlling, too quick to accuse him? Should she have ignored the signs, pretended everything was fine, like so many other women seemed to do? The actress haunted her thoughts, a constant reminder of all the things Rachel felt she lacked. She imagined the woman's life, her confidence, her grace, the effortless way she seemed to fit into Kunle's new world. Rachel couldn't stop comparing herself, and with each passing day, her insecurities grew deeper. She studied her reflection in the mirror, tracing every line on her face, every curve, every flaw she could find. Was this why Kunle had left? Had she stopped being enough for him? The questions consumed her, swirling endlessly in her mind like a storm she couldn't escape. Yet beneath the anger, the hurt, and the crushing self-doubt, a fragile flicker of hope refused to die. She held on to it with everything she had, praying that the man she had loved for so many years still existed somewhere beneath the polished surface of his new life. Maybe, she thought, if she changed herself, lost weight, lightened her skin, did whatever it took, he would come back to her. Maybe their family could be whole again. But even as she clung to that fragile hope, a darker doubt crept in during the silence of the night. It whispered cruel questions that gnawed at her resolve. Would the man she was fighting so hard to win back even recognize the woman she was becoming? Rachel sat on the edge of her bed, the soft light from the bedside lamp stretching shadows across the walls. The house was eerily quiet, the faint hum of the ceiling fan overhead filling the void left by Kunle's absence. The steady rhythm of his breathing, once a comforting presence beside her, was gone, leaving only silence. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, as if trying to ward off the chill that seemed to creep from within. The empty space beside her felt heavier than ever, a stark reminder of what she had lost, or maybe of something she had never really possessed. 14 years. That was how long she had poured herself into this marriage, into building a life with Kunle. She had been there through every failure, every disappointment, every fleeting victory. She had invested not just her time, but her heart, her dreams, and her very identity. And now, as she sat alone in the quiet of the night, she couldn't help but wonder if it had all been for nothing. The questions came in waves, relentless and unyielding. Was it her fault? Had she been too demanding, too controlling, too focused on what Kunle wasn't giving her, rather than appreciating what he had? Or had she simply been blind, refusing to see the cracks in their foundation until it was too late? She replayed every argument in her mind, every moment of tension, searching for the exact point where everything had begun to fall apart. But the answers eluded her, slipping through her fingers like sand. Her thoughts turned to the other woman, the actress who now occupied Kunle's time and attention. Rachel had seen the pictures, heard the whispers. The woman was beautiful, sophisticated, and confident in a way that Rachel no longer felt. She couldn't help but compare herself, scrutinizing every flaw and imperfection in the mirror. Her body, once firm and full of vitality, now bore the marks of childbirth and years of sacrifice. Her skin, once radiant, had lost its youthful glow. She felt faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. "I'll do it," Rachel whispered, her voice shaky and almost unrecognizable. The thought had been circling her mind for days, lingering in every quiet moment. And now it gripped her with a force she couldn't push away. If losing weight, reshaping her body, or lightening her skin was what it would take to bring Kunle back, then she would do it. She would do anything. The realization filled her with a strange mix of determination and despair, a bitter cocktail she forced herself to swallow without hesitation. What other choice did she have? But as she made her silent vow, a deeper pain stirred within her, one she couldn't ignore. Why should she have to change herself to be worthy of the man who had already broken her heart? Why should she have to fight for someone who had so easily turned his back on her and their family? The questions burned in her chest, each one sharper than the last. Yet she shoved them aside, burying them beneath her resolve. This wasn't about fairness. This was about survival, about holding on to the life she had built, the family she had fought so hard to keep intact. Rachel sank to her knees beside the bed, her weight pressing into the worn carpet as she clasped her hands together. Her voice, barely above a whisper, trembled as she spoke. "God," she began, her eyes squeezed shut. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I'm not perfect. But please, bring him back to me. Bring him back to our family." Her words came in broken, uneven bursts, each one heavy with a mix of desperation and fragile hope. She begged for strength, for clarity, for a miracle. She prayed for the man Kunle had once been, the man who had held her hand and filled her heart with promises of a life they would build together. She prayed for the family they had dreamed of, a vision now as delicate and breakable as glass. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and relentless, soaking into the neckline of her nightgown. She wept for the years she had poured into loving a man who now felt like a stranger. She wept for her children, who still asked for their father with innocent, hopeful eyes, unaware of the storm brewing around them. Most of all, she wept for herself, the woman she once was, full of light and determination, now lost in the shadows of pain and doubt. When the sobs finally subsided, Rachel stayed on her knees, her head bowed low and her hands trembling. The silence that filled the room was deafening, a vast emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. She remained there, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, a sign, a whisper, a feeling that her prayers hadn't been lost in the void. But the room offered no answers, only the quiet ache of uncertainty. When she finally rose, her body felt heavy, as though the weight of her grief had seeped into her very bones. She climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket tightly around her. The ache in her chest hadn't subsided, but a small ember of hope still burned within her, faint but persistent. As she closed her eyes, a single thought echoed in her mind. Would Kunle come back? And if he did, at what cost to herself? The question lingered, unanswered, as Rachel drifted into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with flickering images of the life she so desperately wanted to reclaim.